let's get started. Story number 1.
The snow began falling late in the afternoon, soft flakes drifting lazily from the steel-gray sky. Jack, Lisa, and Tom had set out early that morning to hike into the backcountry and spend the night camping under the stars. The forecast had called for light snow showers, nothing serious. They had joked about their winter wonderland adventure as they strapped on their packs and trudged deeper into the wilderness. By the time they reached the plateau where they planned to set up camp, the snow had grown heavier, the wind biting. The sun was sinking fast, and the gray twilight made it harder to see the trail behind them. They quickly pitched their tents in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, the trees swaying and groaning under the weight of the gathering storm. "This'll blow over by morning," Jack said as he lit the small propane stove to heat water for their freeze-dried meals. "We'll wake up to sunshine and fresh powder. It'll be perfect." Lisa pulled her jacket tighter, her eyes scanning the trees. "I hope so. This wind is freaky, though. It sounds like voices." Tom chuckled, though his laugh was strained. "It's just the wind. It always sounds weird in the woods." Jack handed out the steaming packets of food, and they ate quickly, huddled close to the stove for warmth. The snow kept falling, the wind howling through the trees, and darkness closed in around them like a heavy curtain. Lisa was the first to crawl into her tent, muttering about how exhausted she was. Tom followed soon after, leaving Jack to take the first watch. They had agreed to keep a fire going through the night, just in case the storm got worse and they needed to stay warm. The hours dragged as Jack sat by the flickering flames, his face numb despite the fire's heat. The forest was eerily quiet except for the wind, which now seemed to carry an almost melodic quality. Jack shook his head, trying to shake the unease creeping over him. It was just the isolation, he told himself. The snowstorm, the darkness. These things played tricks on the mind. And then he saw it. A faint light flickering through the trees. He squinted, leaning forward. At first, he thought it was a reflection of the firelight, but it was too far away and it moved, bobbing gently like someone walking with a lantern. "Hey!" he called, his voice cracking in the cold air. "Who's out there?" The light paused, then began to move closer. Jack's pulse quickened. He grabbed his flashlight and stood, the beam cutting through the falling snow. "Hello?" he called again. No response. The light vanished, swallowed by the dark. Jack felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He turned back to the fire, telling himself it was probably a reflection or even his imagination. But as he settled back into his seat, he realized the woods had grown silent. The wind had stopped entirely, leaving an oppressive stillness that made his ears ring. Something rustled behind him. Jack spun, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the trees and the falling snow. His heart pounded as he sat down again, the unease now a constant weight pressing against his chest. When Lisa and Tom emerged from their tents in the morning, Jack didn't tell them about the light. He didn't want to freak them out, especially since the storm had finally passed. The forest was blanketed in pristine snow, the sky a brilliant blue. It was as if the night before had been a bad dream. But as they packed up their gear, Lisa frowned and pointed to the edge of the clearing. "Did someone come through here last night?" Jack followed her gaze and froze. Footprints. They weren't theirs. The tracks were small, like those of a child, and they led into the trees. The three of them stared at the trail in uneasy silence. "It's probably some hiker who got lost in the storm," Tom said, though his voice lacked confidence. Jack shook his head. "A kid out here in this weather?" Lisa shivered. "We should follow them. What if someone needs help?" Jack hesitated. The memory of the light flickering in the woods was still fresh in his mind, but Lisa was already moving, her boots crunching in the snow as she followed the tracks. Tom and Jack exchanged a glance before hurrying after her. The footprints led deeper into the forest, winding between the trees in a strange, almost meandering pattern. It didn't look like someone trying to find their way out. It looked like someone playing. Lisa stopped suddenly, her breath hitching. "Oh my God!" she whispered. Jack and Tom came to her side and saw what she was looking at. The footprints ended abruptly in the middle of the clearing. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence that the person had turned back. They simply stopped. "That doesn't make any sense," Tom said, his voice barely audible. Jack scanned the woods, his pulse racing. The silence was back, thick and suffocating, and he realized he could no longer hear the birds or the wind. The forest felt dead. "We need to go," Jack said firmly. "Now." Lisa nodded, her face pale. They turned and started back the way they'd come, but the path was gone, swallowed by the snow. Jack swore under his breath, his heart pounding. How had they gotten turned around? "Over here," Tom said, pointing to a faint trail of broken branches. "This way." They followed him, their breaths clouding the air as they moved quickly through the trees. But the further they went, the more disoriented they became. The forest seemed to shift around them, the trees closing in, the snow falling heavier once again. And then they saw it. A cabin. It sat crookedly in a small clearing, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. The windows were dark and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking as it swayed in the faint breeze. "No way," Lisa said, taking a step back. "We're not going in there." "We don't have a choice," Jack said, though his stomach churned at the thought. "We need to get out of this storm, and maybe there's a map or supplies inside." Tom nodded reluctantly, and they approached the cabin together. The air grew colder as they stepped onto the rickety porch, and Jack's hand trembled as he pushed the door open. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled of damp wood and something metallic. A small fireplace sat in the corner, cold and empty. Dust-covered furniture was scattered haphazardly, and the walls were lined with deep scratches, as though an animal had clawed at them. But it was the far wall that made them stop. Handprints, dozens of them, smeared across the wood in what looked like ash. Small handprints the size of a child's, all pressed against the wall as though they were trying to escape. Lisa whimpered, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is this place?" Jack stepped closer, his flashlight beam flickering. Beneath the handprints, words were scrawled in jagged letters. "We're still cold. We're still here." The cabin groaned, the walls seeming to close in. The temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the icy air, and then they heard it. The sound of children laughing, faint and hollow, coming from all around them. "Run!" Jack shouted, grabbing Lisa's arm and pulling her toward the door. But as they reached the threshold, the laughter turned into screams. High-pitched, desperate wails that pierced their ears. Jack stumbled into the snow, his heart racing as the cabin loomed behind them like a dark, hungry mouth. They didn't stop running until they found the trail again, the storm suddenly easing as though they'd crossed an invisible boundary. When they finally reached their car, none of them spoke. They drove in silence, the memory of the cabin hanging over them like a shadow. Years later, Jack would return to the area, unable to shake the feeling that something had been left unfinished. But when he searched for the clearing, it was gone. There was no sign of the cabin, no footprints, no handprints on the walls, only the wind carrying with it the faint sound of children laughing. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The wind howled through the towering pines as snow swirled in blinding gusts. Dan tightened his hood against the bitter cold and glanced at his friends, Emma and Joel, trudging just behind him. Their breaths formed clouds that were instantly whisked away by the gale. It was supposed to be a quick weekend camping trip, a chance to disconnect from their busy lives and enjoy the solitude of nature. None of them had anticipated the storm. "We should have stayed in the cabin," Joel shouted over the wind. His voice cracked with frustration and fear. Emma's face was pale, her teeth chattering. "It wasn't supposed to snow this much," she replied, her words carried off into the night. Dan squinted ahead. They were deep in the woods, far from any help. The GPS on his phone had lost its signal hours ago, and the trail they'd followed was long buried beneath layers of snow. He didn't want to admit it, but they were lost. "There's a clearing up ahead," Dan called out, trying to mask his own unease. "We can set up camp there." When they reached the clearing, the snowfall eased briefly, allowing them to set up their tents in relative calm. The surrounding forest loomed like a wall of shadows, and the silence, save for the faint whisper of the wind, felt oppressive. Dan lit a small fire, its flickering flames offering the only warmth in the vast, frozen wilderness. Emma huddled close to the fire, her face drawn with exhaustion. "Do you think anyone will come looking for us?" Joel shook his head. "Not until we miss our check-in tomorrow. And even then, this storm will make it impossible." Dan forced a reassuring smile. "We'll be fine. The storm will pass by morning, and we'll find the trail." But deep down, he wasn't so sure. The night dragged on, the cold seeping into their bones, despite the fire. Dan took the first watch, sitting outside the tents as his friends tried to sleep. The snow began falling again, heavier this time, muting the world in an eerie blanket of white. As he stared into the dark woods, he felt a strange unease creep over him, a prickling at the back of his neck. It wasn't just the storm, it was something else. A sound broke the stillness, faint but distinct. It was like a voice, carried on the wind, distant and mournful. Dan sat up straighter, straining to hear. The voice came again, clearer this time, a soft, lilting melody that sent chills down his spine. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaking. "Is someone there?" The singing stopped abruptly, leaving only the whisper of the snow. Dan's heart pounded as he scanned the darkness, but he saw nothing. He told himself it was just the wind playing tricks on him, but the unease lingered. When it was Joel's turn to take watch, Dan climbed into his tent, grateful for the brief reprieve. Sleep came fitfully, his dreams plagued by shadowy figures moving silently through the snow. He woke with a start hours later to Emma shaking him. "Dan, wake up! Something's wrong," she whispered, her voice trembling. He stumbled out of the tent, his breath catching when he saw Joel standing at the edge of the clearing. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows. Joel was facing the woods, motionless, his head tilted as if listening to something. "Joel?" Dan called, but his friend didn't respond. Emma grabbed his arm. "He's been like that for 15 minutes. I tried talking to him, but it's like he doesn't hear me." Dan approached cautiously. "Joel, man, what are you doing? Come back to the fire." Without turning, Joel spoke in a flat, distant voice. "They're calling me." Dan froze. "Who's calling you?" "The people in the woods. They want me to follow them." Emma gasped. "There's no one out there, Joel. You're just hearing things." But Joel shook his head. "I saw them. A woman and a child. They were standing right there." He pointed into the darkness. "They need my help." Dan exchanged a worried glance with Emma. "You're just tired. Come sit down. We'll figure this out in the morning." Joel finally turned to look at them, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "You didn't see them?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "They were right there." Dan put a hand on Joel's shoulder, guiding him back to the fire. "It's just the storm messing with your head. Stay close to us, okay?" Joel nodded reluctantly, but his gaze kept drifting back to the woods. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, the fire their only anchor in the oppressive darkness. The strange singing returned, faint and haunting, but now all three of them heard it. Dan tried to rationalize it, maybe it was the wind or an animal, but the melody was too deliberate, too human. None of them slept. By morning, the storm had eased, but a thick fog had settled over the forest, reducing visibility to mere feet. The unease from the night lingered, and they decided to break camp and try to find their way back. As they packed, Joel stopped suddenly, staring at the snow. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to a set of footprints leading away from the clearing. The prints were small, like those of a child, and they led into the woods. Dan's stomach churned. "They weren't there last night," he said. "They're real," Joel murmured, his voice filled with a mix of awe and fear. "I told you I saw them." Emma shook her head. "We're not following those. It's not safe." But Joel was already moving, following the tracks. Dan grabbed his arm. "Joel, stop! We need to stick together." Joel yanked his arm free, his expression defiant. "I can't just ignore this. What if someone needs our help?" "Joel, wait!" Emma cried, but he was already disappearing into the fog. Dan and Emma had no choice but to follow, their voices calling after him. The tracks led deeper into the forest, winding through the trees in an erratic path. The air grew colder, the silence oppressive. Finally, they found Joel standing in a small clearing, staring at something in the snow. When they reached him, Dan's breath caught. It was an old, crumbling cabin, half buried in snow. The windows were shattered, the door hanging ajar. "They went inside," Joel said, his voice flat. Dan shook his head. "No way. We're not going in there." But Joel didn't wait for an answer. He stepped toward the cabin, his movements stiff and mechanical, as if he were being pulled by an invisible force. Emma clung to Dan's arm. "We can't let him go in alone." Against his better judgment, Dan followed Joel into the cabin, Emma close behind. The interior was dark and cold, the walls lined with rotting wood. A strange metallic smell hung in the air. Joel stopped in the center of the room, staring at the far wall. Dan followed his gaze and froze. There, etched into the wood, were dozens of handprints, small and faint, as if made by children. Beneath them, words were scrawled in a jagged script. We were cold, we were hungry, we are still here. Emma's breathing quickened. We need to leave. Now. Dan nodded, but Joel didn't move. He was staring at something on the floor, a small, worn teddy bear, half covered in frost. Joel, let's go, Dan urged, grabbing his arm. But Joel didn't respond. He picked up the bear, cradling it in his hands. They're here, he whispered. I can feel them. The temperature plummeted, their breaths visible in the icy air. The cabin seemed to groan, the walls closing in. And then the singing began again, louder and more distinct, as if coming from all around them. Emma screamed, and Dan turned to see shadowy figures materializing in the corners of the room. Children with hollow eyes and frostbitten skin. Behind them stood a woman, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes filled with a sorrow that pierced Dan's soul. Leave, she said, her voice a chilling whisper. This is our home. Dan grabbed Joel, pulling him toward the door. We're leaving. We're sorry, he shouted, his voice cracking. The shadows didn't move, but the air grew heavier, pressing down on them. Emma sobbed, her grip on Dan's arm tight. With all his strength, Dan dragged Joel out of the cabin and into the snow. The moment they crossed the threshold, the oppressive feeling lifted and the singing stopped. They ran, the fog swallowing the cabin behind them. By the time they reached their original campsite, Joel collapsed, the teddy bear still clutched in his hand. His eyes were wide, his face pale. They were real, he whispered. They're trapped there. Dan and Emma didn't respond. They packed their gear in silence, the weight of the experience hanging heavy over them. They found their way back to the main trail hours later, guided by sheer luck and desperation. When they reached the safety of their car, Joel finally let go of the bear, leaving it in the snow. None of them spoke as they drove away, the forest receding into the distance. But as they reached the edge of the woods, Dan glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Standing just beyond the trees was the woman, her hollow eyes watching them go. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snow began to fall earlier than expected. Light at first, a peaceful cascade that whispered against the trees. The four of us, Ben, Laura, Ethan, and me, were on the second day of a winter camping trip in the remote forests of northern Maine. We'd planned for a brisk hike followed by 2 nights of camping, but the weather forecast had undersold the storm. By mid-afternoon, the snow thickened into a blinding white wall and the temperature plummeted. We need to set up camp now, Ethan said, his voice tense as he scanned the gray sky. Ben, the most experienced camper among us, nodded. We won't make it to the planned site in this. Let's find some cover and get the tents up. We found a small clearing near a grove of towering pines and hurriedly pitched our tents. The wind began to howl, rattling the fabric as we secured it with frozen fingers. By the time we were done, the snow was knee-deep, and the world around us had turned into an icy void. We huddled in one tent, sharing body heat and eating cold granola bars. The propane stove refused to light in the wind. Think it'll let up by morning? Laura asked, her voice trembling from the cold and something else. Fear. Ben hesitated before answering. Storms like this can last a while, but we're sheltered enough. We'll be okay. The words didn't feel reassuring. Outside, the wind screeched, rising and falling in pitch. It sounded almost alive, like a chorus of mournful voices. I exchanged a glance with Laura. Her wide eyes mirrored my unease. We should sleep in shifts, I suggested. Just in case. Ethan shrugged. In case of what? I don't know. Anything. The storm getting worse. Animals. Whatever. Ben agreed, and we set up a rotation. I volunteered for the first watch. The others crawled into their sleeping bags, leaving me alone with the dim glow of our lantern and the relentless storm outside. The tent fabric quivered and groaned under the assault of the wind. I tried to focus on the sounds of my friend's breathing, the rhythm steady and reassuring. But then I heard it. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on snow. I froze, straining to listen. At first, I thought it was the wind shifting the snowdrifts, but it came again, deliberate and rhythmic. Someone or something was outside. Ben, I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned, half asleep. What? Listen. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched so long that I almost thought I'd imagined it. And then a voice came, soft and distant. Help me. It was faint, carried by the wind, but unmistakably human. Did you hear that? I hissed, my heart pounding. Ben was wide awake now. What was it? Someone's out there, I said, pointing toward the tent's entrance. The voice came again, louder this time. Help me, please. Ethan and Laura stirred, sitting up in alarm. Is someone out there? Laura whispered, her voice trembling. I think so, I said. They're asking for help. Ben grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, poking his head out. The beam of light pierced the swirling snow, revealing nothing but white. Hello? He called. The wind howled back. There's no one. Ben started, but then we all heard it. Over here, the voice cried, desperate now. It was closer. Ben grabbed his jacket and boots. Stay here, he ordered. You're not going alone, I said, grabbing my own gear. Laura and Ethan exchanged nervous glances but stayed behind as Ben and I stepped into the storm. The cold was like a physical blow, stealing my breath and numbing my face within seconds. We followed the voice, our flashlights barely cutting through the snow. Hello, Ben shouted. Where are you? Here, the voice answered, so close it made me jump. But there was no one there. The footprints appeared suddenly, as if etched into the snow right in front of us. They led deeper into the forest, away from the tents. This doesn't feel right, I said, glancing nervously at Ben. He nodded, but kept walking. If someone's out here, we can't just leave them. We followed the footprints for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. The trees seemed to press closer, their branches heavy with snow. Ben, I said, stopping in my tracks. What? I pointed. Ahead of us was a figure. It was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakably human-shaped. It stood motionless, watching us. Hey! Ben called, moving toward it. Wait! I grabbed his arm. The figure stepped backward, fading into the snow. Did you see that? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the wind. Ben nodded, his face pale. Yeah! The footsteps in the snow vanished as if swallowed by the storm. We need to go back, I said. Ben didn't argue. We turned and retraced our steps, or tried to. The storm had erased our tracks, and the forest around us looked unfamiliar. Do you remember which way we came from? Ben asked, his voice tight with panic. I shook my head. Everything was white, a never-ending expanse of snow and shadows. And then we heard the voices. Not just one, but many. They came from all directions, overlapping whispers that seemed to seep into my skin. Over here. Help us. Don't leave. I grabbed Ben's arm, my fingers trembling. Run. We bolted through the snow, our flashlights bouncing wildly. The voices followed, growing louder and more frantic. When we finally stumbled into the clearing where the tents should have been, my heart sank. The campsite was gone. Where are they? Ben gasped, spinning in circles. The tents, the gear, everything. It had vanished, leaving only untouched snow. No, I muttered, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The wind shifted and a new sound emerged. Laughter. It was faint at first, then louder, echoing around us. Ben grabbed my arm. We have to keep moving. We trudged through the snow, aimless and desperate. The laughter faded, replaced by a low, guttural growl. I turned and froze. The figure was back, standing at the edge of the trees. Its face was pale, almost glowing, and its eyes were black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It raised a hand, pointing directly at us. Go! Ben shouted, yanking me forward. We ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would burst. Finally, we collapsed in a small hollow beneath an overhang of rock. The storm raged on, but the voices were gone. We sat in silence, too exhausted to speak. At some point, I must have passed out because I woke to the pale light of dawn filtering through the snow. Ben was sitting beside me, staring blankly ahead. Are you okay? I asked. He shook his head. The others, they're gone. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of Laura or Ethan. When we finally stumbled out of the forest and found a ranger station, we told them what had happened. Search teams combed the area for days but found nothing. No tents, no footprints, no sign that anyone had ever been there. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that storm. But sometimes when the wind howls in the dead of winter, I swear I hear the voices again. Help me. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snow began falling as Alex, Mia, and James set up their campsite deep in the backcountry. They had planned the trip weeks ago, a late winter escape before spring officially thawed the wilderness. The forecast had mentioned a chance of light snow, but nothing extreme. Still, as they unpacked their gear, the wind began to pick up, and thick flakes started to fall faster, coating the ground and their jackets. Maybe we should have stuck to the cabin, Mia muttered, and then glancing at the darkening sky. Alex grinned, shaking snow off his gloves. Where's the adventure in that? We'll be fine. It's just a little snow. James gave a wary look toward the trees. Let's get the tents up fast, just in case. We don't want to be doing this in the middle of a storm. They worked quickly, pitching their 2 small tents in the clearing they'd chosen. The trees around them formed a natural windbreak, but the air felt colder by the minute. By the time the tents were up, the snow was coming down hard, and the wind was whistling through the branches with an eerie, high-pitched tone. The 3 huddled around a small fire as the storm intensified. The light from the flames flickered weakly against the swirling snow, barely holding back the encroaching darkness. Alex boiled water for their instant meals while Mia and James sat close, their faces tense. This is worse than I thought it'd be, Mia said, pulling her jacket tighter around her. What if we can't find the trail back tomorrow? James poked at the fire with a stick. We'll figure it out. We have the GPS. Worst case, we wait it out until the storm passes. Alex tried to lighten the mood. Hey, we'll have a story to tell, right? That time we survived a blizzard in the wilderness. But Mia wasn't smiling. It's not funny, Alex. This storm doesn't feel normal. James glanced at her. What do you mean? I don't know. She hesitated, looking into the trees. It's just, I feel like we're being watched. Alex laughed nervously. Come on, Mia, it's just the wind playing tricks on you. But as the words left his mouth, a sharp crack echoed through the forest, loud and sudden. All 3 of them jumped, their heads snapping toward the sound. What was that? Mia whispered. Probably a branch breaking under the snow, Alex said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. James stood, shining his flashlight toward the edge of the clearing. The beam cut through the swirling snow, illuminating only the dense trunks of trees. I don't see anything, he said, but he didn't sit back down. They finished their meals in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound besides the storm. One by one, they retreated to their tents, leaving the fire to burn out on its own. Alex took the first watch, sitting just outside his tent with a flashlight and knife at his side, more for comfort than anything else. The snow fell harder, muffling the world around him. The storm seemed to have swallowed the forest whole, leaving only the sound of the wind and the faint creak of trees bending under the weight of the snow. Alex fought to keep his eyes open, his breath fogging in the frigid air, and then he saw it. A figure, barely visible through the trees, standing motionless in the snow. His heart leapt into his throat as he scrambled to grab his flashlight. He pointed the beam toward the figure, but it was gone. The light revealed only empty woods, the snow falling in endless, ghostly sheets. Hello? He called, his voice shaking. Is someone there? No answer. The wind howled in response, its pitch rising to an almost human wail. Alex tried to convince himself it was a trick of the storm, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He stayed awake until his watch ended, the flashlight clutched tightly in his hand. When James woke to take his turn, Alex didn't tell him what he'd seen. He didn't want to scare him, or worse, confirm that he wasn't imagining things. The next morning, they woke to an eerie stillness. The storm had passed, leaving a heavy blanket of snow that swallowed the world in silence. The fire pit was buried, and their tracks from the day before were completely erased. Alex, Mia, and James packed up quickly, eager to find the trail and head back to civilization. But as they prepared to leave, Mia froze, staring at the ground near the edge of the clearing. Do you see that? She whispered. Alex and James followed her gaze. There in the fresh snow were footprints. They were small, like those of a child, and they led into the forest. James frowned. Who else would be out here in a storm like that? No one, Mia said, her voice tight. That's the point. Alex felt a chill creep up his spine. We should follow them. What if someone's lost? Mia hesitated. What if it's not someone? They stared at her, but she didn't elaborate. Reluctantly, they began to follow the tracks, their boots crunching in the snow. The footprints weaved between the trees in a strange, erratic pattern, leading them deeper into the forest. After nearly an hour of walking, the tracks suddenly stopped. Alex stared at the spot, his breath catching. There was no sign of struggle, no indication that whoever had made the tracks had turned around. They simply ended. That's not possible, James muttered. Where did they go? Mia took a step back, her face pale. We shouldn't be here. Before Alex could respond, a faint sound drifted through the trees. It was soft at first, almost like the wind, but as they listened, it grew clearer. A melody, a child's voice humming a slow, haunting tune. Mia grabbed Alex's arm. "We need to leave. Now." The humming grew louder, coming from all directions at once. The forest seemed to close in, the trees leaning toward them as if trying to block their escape. Panic set in and they turned, running back the way they'd come. But the forest was unrecognizable. The snow had buried their footprints, and every tree looked the same. The humming followed them, growing louder, more insistent. Finally, they stumbled into a clearing and stopped dead in their tracks. A small cabin sat in the center, its roof sagging under the weight of the snow. The windows were dark and the door hung slightly open, swaying in the faint breeze. "That wasn't there before," James whispered. "We're not going in," Mia said firmly, her voice trembling. "I don't care what's inside. We're not going in." But as they turned to leave, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse, thick and oppressive, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. The door to the cabin creaked open wider. Alex felt an overwhelming pull, as though something inside the cabin was calling to him. He took a step forward, his legs moving on their own. "Alex, don't!" Mia cried, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. He stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under his weight. The air inside the cabin was icy, colder than the storm outside. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thin layer of frost, and in the center of the room sat a single chair facing the far wall. Alex's breath caught as he saw what was on the wall. Dozens of handprints, small and faint, pressed into the frost-covered wood. Beneath them, scrawled in what looked like soot, were the words, "We never left." A child's laughter rang out, high-pitched and echoing. Alex stumbled back, tripping over the threshold as Mia and James dragged him away from the cabin. They didn't stop running until they found the trail again, the trees thinning as they neared the edge of the forest. When they finally reached the car, none of them spoke. They sat in silence, the memory of the cabin and the haunting laughter etched into their minds. None of them ever returned to that forest. But sometimes on cold winter nights, Alex would wake to the sound of faint humming carried on the wind. Story, the end.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm began as a whisper, a light dusting that clung to the pine trees like powdered sugar. Jackson, Dana, and I, 3 friends chasing the thrill of winter camping, laughed it off. We were deep in the Catskills, miles away from the nearest road, our campsite nestled at the edge of a frozen lake. The forecast had mentioned snow, but nothing severe. By the time we realized the storm wasn't going to stay mild, it was too late to pack up and leave. The wind roared across the lake, bending the trees and sending flurries whipping against our faces. We huddled in the tent, listening to the fabric snap like a sail caught in a gale. "Guess this'll be a good story someday," Jackson said, his voice forced cheerful as he adjusted his sleeping bag. Dana didn't laugh. She was staring at the lantern between us, her fingers worrying the edge of her scarf. "You okay?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "Did either of you hear a knock just now?" Jackson and I exchanged a look. The wind outside was deafening, but I hadn't heard anything resembling a knock. "It's probably a branch," Jackson said. "The wind's nuts out there." Dana nodded, but her face stayed pale. We tried to sleep, but the storm made it impossible. The tent shuddered violently, and the temperature dropped so low that my breath came out in thick, freezing clouds. I kept my head tucked into my sleeping bag, listening to the wind and trying to will myself into unconsciousness. That's when I heard it. A knock. 3 sharp, deliberate taps on the tent wall. I froze. My first thought was that Jackson had moved in his sleep and hit the side of the tent, but when I glanced over, he was still, his face buried in his sleeping bag. "Jackson?" I whispered. He stirred, blinking groggily. "What? Did you hear that? Hear what?" Before I could answer, the knocks came again. This time louder. Dana sat up abruptly, her eyes wide. "There it is again. You heard it, right?" Jackson frowned, sitting up too. "It's just the wind." "That's not the wind," Dana snapped, her voice sharp with fear. The 3 of us sat in tense silence, waiting. The wind howled, the tent creaked, and for a long moment there was nothing else. Then, from outside, a voice. "Hello?" It was faint, muffled by the storm, but unmistakably human. "Did you hear that?" Dana whispered. "Yeah," I said, my heart pounding. It sounded like someone's out there. Jackson grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent flap just enough to shine the beam into the swirling snow. "Hello?" he called. The wind swallowed his voice, but then, faintly, we heard it again. "Hello? Please. Help." It was a man's voice, trembling and weak. "We can't just ignore that," Jackson said, pulling on his boots and jacket. "Wait," Dana said, grabbing his arm. "What if it's—" "What?" Jackson interrupted. "What if it's what?" Dana didn't finish her sentence. Instead, she just shook her head, her expression full of dread. "I'm going out," Jackson said firmly. He looked at me. "You coming?" Against my better judgment, I nodded. I couldn't let him go out there alone. The cold hit like a slap as we stepped out of the tent, the snow already waist-deep. The flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, its beams swallowed by the blizzard. "Where are you?" Jackson shouted. "Here," the voice called back. It sounded closer now, just beyond the tree line. We trudged forward, each step a struggle against the snow and wind. The voice kept guiding us, always just out of reach. "Over here," it said. "Please, hurry." Something about the tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was desperate, yes, but there was something else, something hollow and strange. "Jackson, wait," I said, grabbing his arm. He turned to me, annoyed. "What? This doesn't feel right. What if it's a trap?" He hesitated, glancing into the darkness. "What kind of trap? Someone could be freezing out here." I couldn't argue with that. Guilt gnawed at me as we pressed on, the voice drawing us deeper into the forest. And then we saw him. A man stood in the clearing, his back to us. He was tall and thin, wearing clothes that seemed far too light for the weather, an old coat and a wide-brimmed hat dusted with snow. His arms hung limply at his sides. "Hey!" Jackson shouted. "Are you okay?" The man didn't move. "Sir?" I called, my voice shaking. Slowly he turned to face us. I'll never forget that face. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes were empty pits of darkness. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, the wind around us seemed to grow louder, carrying whispers that didn't belong to the storm. "Jackson, we need to go," I said, backing away. But Jackson was frozen, staring at the man. "Jackson!" I grabbed his arm and yanked him backward. The man's head tilted unnaturally, his empty eyes fixed on us. The whispers turned into a scream, high-pitched and inhuman. We ran. The snow seemed to pull at our legs, slowing us down as if trying to trap us. The screams followed, blending with the wind until I couldn't tell where they ended and the storm began. When we finally reached the campsite, we dove into the tent, slamming the flap shut behind us. Dana was sitting upright, her face pale. "What happened?" she demanded. We saw someone," I stammered, struggling to catch my breath. Jackson didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the ground, his face pale and his hands trembling. "What do you mean? You saw someone?" Dana pressed. Before I could answer, the knocks came again. 3 sharp taps on the tent wall. "Go away!" Dana screamed. The knocks stopped. For the rest of the night, none of us spoke. We sat in silence, huddled together as the storm raged outside. By morning, the snow had stopped, and the sun cast an eerie glow over the landscape. The forest was silent, the only sound our boots crunching in the fresh snow as we packed up camp. But as we prepared to leave, Jackson froze. "Guys," he said, his voice hollow. We turned to see what he was looking at. There in the snow were footprints leading away from the campsite. They didn't belong to us. The prints were long and deep, spaced unnaturally far apart, as if something with impossibly long legs had walked through the clearing. They led toward the forest and disappeared into the shadows. None of us said a word. We left everything we couldn't carry and didn't stop hiking until we reached the car. We never spoke about what happened that night, but sometimes when the wind howls, I swear I hear it, the faint sound of knocking and a voice whispering, "Help me." Story the end.